Thank you very much to all four of you. I think this panel really took us from the creation of the city with Michelle's paper to the limits of the city, and I think this is one of the terms that you used earlier in your presentation. Before we open up to the floor, and I'm sure there are many questions here, I wanted to direct at least two questions to you. In the case of Rohan, we were discussing with you the official nation building rhetoric, especially under Jawaharlal Nehru. And in the case of Michelle's paper, it was very much family archives that you showed us. And in several cases, it seems these were the archives of the students that you worked with and who are now taking care in charge of the project. Can you tell us, Michelle, about the official rhetoric? How much are the stories that you presented personal family stories, and how much are they national stories?
Thank you for that question. Actually, it was a pretty even balance for this project, and the project continued. So, for example, we went to Boston after the Biennale, and we worked recovering interviews of TAC members and talked to them, went actually to their homes as well. But the Biennale effort was an equal distribution, I would say, between recovering architectural and engineering records that have not been in the public realm. So many of those records, as we've been discussing, are for architects and engineers who came and worked in this country during the 70s and 80s, and then when they repatriated to their own countries, they brought their files with them. So a huge part of the effort of this project was to recover those records. And if you look through the publication, and also if you had been to the exhibition, you would have seen that we were very careful in keeping a balance between those two voices and those two experiences in the creation of the city.
Ricardo, you're from Algarve or Alentejo?
I'm from Algarve.
From which city?
Silves.
Okay. As you alluded to your own personal history, that's where I was asking. I wanted to ask you about the limits of the city, and you seem to present, of course, a critical perspective on how modernization is connected to the making of the city. Now, in the case of South Asia, and very specifically of India, they are, and this was part of what you were presenting and telling us about, Rohan, there is an unresolved tension, I would say, between the village, which is still considered as the primary unit of identity building in India, and the city and its urban transformation and the ideas of modernization. How is it in the UAE, and can you tell us about in the UAE and in the Gulf more broadly, your experience of Kuwait and of working in the region more broadly, in regard to the village and the tensions between the village and the city? Because you seem to have a critical perspective, but you told us a bit less about what was happening and what sort of policies were directed in these specific years that you're looking at towards the village, and if there's any sustainable living that is being thought and developed there by the state, that is.
I look at it from the perspective of an architect. What I think is that, especially since mid-20th century, that the dismantling of the city as we still imagine is taking place. We're still talking about a city that I think doesn't exist anymore. And it's in that sense that I talk here. And especially architects. Architects operate in a way as they believe their building exists or will perform in a city which I think doesn't exist anymore. And I'm talking about a city that is solidary, a city that is made of a community, a city that has public spaces that are shared, a city where the building perimeter is a negotiation between the ones who live there and the ones who are outside. And when we talk about the region, I think that phenomenon is even stronger if we look at places such as Dubai or Kuwait. In terms of the reminiscence of a kind of a rural identity and how relevant that is for these cities, I can't talk much about Dubai. I can talk about what I know in Kuwait. And one of the interesting phenomena in Kuwait is that most of the migration or the people who migrated to Kuwait and inhabited this expanded city were people coming from rural environments, either from India, either from Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon. And that's something very, I think, very, very interesting, because somehow in many of these neighborhoods, and especially in places as Awali, for example, in Kuwait, they were able to reproduce that village condition within a city suburbia. I don't think the same exists in the typical residential neighborhood populated by Kuwaitis. And I think there, the limits of plot, the division between street and private property are so strong that there is neither a reminiscent of what we understand as the classical city, and I'm talking about the history of civilization, let's say, or the rural village. And I think this is a dilemma where cities like Kuwait and eventually Dubai live, which is a non-city. And I think for us as architects, is eventually important to get rid of this notion of city and understand how other factors play a role on the construction of physical space.
Please raise your hands for those of you who have questions. Well, we have two already here. Can you just speak up so that we can hear you? Oh, there's a mic, great.
Hello. My question will go to Ricardo, and I will pick up on what you've just mentioned. Thanks for the question, Devika. I was also wondering about the same thing. And having stayed in Kuwait, I know there are neighborhoods like Mubarakia and Salmiya. You see them and you compare them with typical Kuwaiti residential areas like Qurtuba, and you can tell the difference. You can somehow feel that something as tangible as architecture is not speaking of the intangible inertia that exists in Kuwait now. I mean, sometimes it feels you're still in 80s or 90s, and that's something I wanted to touch upon, because we all have spoken about the development and the arrival of modernity, but we haven't highlighted what's happening now as well. So I just wanted to bring that to the notice of everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. We'll take the second question like this, we can group it.
Maybe just building up on that, thank you all for fantastic presentations. I think, Ricardo, just some of the aspects that you were presenting got me. You were talking about, the region without cities, yet you spent a lot of time discussing cities. I think there is a lot of that kind of, I wonder whether I understood it correctly, because it's almost a simplistic approach to city, and whether we could dislocate that modernity and consider, scholars like Robinson's proposal on ordinary cities. I feel like there is still hierarchy that's attached to how we label cities. We've done that in the West, and it seems like we are applying the same to the Gulf. And I wondered whether you would challenge that proposal by actually looking at some of the maybe new positions in scholarship. Thank you.
I think the two questions might be related, but in my understanding, this idea of looking at the practice of architecture without the city is a tool, is more of a methodology rather than an acknowledgement of the present condition. If we look at places like Mubarakia or Salmi in Kuwait, they had their own history and their own development, but they are still islands, isolated. They don't work as extents of the city. And at a certain point, when we discuss here the process of modernization and how the city operates today, we can't forget that the most of the region had no professionals 80 years ago, or very little expertise 80 years ago, and planning took a lead over everything. So planning and the way how economically the region is structured and the territory is structured prevailed always over anything else. And I think that's a factor to consider. Mubarakia was left as a reminding of what is an old downtown or what is an old market or what is an old center without any kind of reference. And when I'm saying interference, I'm talking about daily life. And that daily life, the residential, is what is missing in Mubarakia. And I think in that sense, the planning and the zoning developed a huge impact in this region that I think it's irreversible. And that should be the project. And that's something I'm seeing happening, for example, in Bahrain. And I think out of all these cities, let's say, where I'm seeing more development towards the understanding of how all this can generate an idea of city today is eventually there. In Manaba, and everything that I'm seeing. In terms of your second question regarding the research and the development of interest beyond this idea of city and architecture, I think one of the problems is the fact that when we talk about present day and when we talk about research, we are constantly talking about these cities. And eventually we have to get rid of that and talking about people who practice in this region, talking about particular buildings, talk about exchanges of knowledge. And I think that will be relevant because we are mainly talking about a different tradition of knowledge production. I don't think we are talking here about the traditional relation between researcher or scholar and environment. We are not talking about someone that sits in Dubai, grew in Dubai, studied in Dubai, developed his own research in Dubai and stays here for all their lives. We are talking about agents of research and knowledge production that are constantly rotating around, in and out of the region. And I think this is a new tool or a new mean for knowledge production that we are not eventually yet ready to understand. And that's my interest, particularly.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered your question.
We had a question. We had a question just here. Joseph, please.
Yeah, for Rohan, between watching your film yesterday and hearing you discuss it today, I want to think about sort of the political valences of nostalgia and how perhaps nostalgia can be mobilized in, I'm thinking of Svetlana Boym's work on the future of nostalgia and how she thinks about how restorative nostalgia operates into sort of a pernicious kind of nationalism, how by looking at, let's say, some of those films from the films division that were, as you acknowledged, nationalist propaganda films, and thinking about what this sort of nostalgic mode of thinking, whether it's within the built environment or the cinematic sort of structure. She has this really nice kind of analogy for nostalgia within the context of cinema, where she says that the cinematic image is a double exposure. It's a way of thinking of home and abroad or past and present at the same time. And I'm wondering how you sort of reconcile that the uses of nostalgia to sort of, let's say, further a particular kind of nationalism, and what that context might be in 2019 versus, let's say, like a Nehruvian context.
Yeah. Oh, you're absolutely right. Nostalgia is a dangerous sort of tendency that we very often have. It's a thing, actually, I don't know about anywhere else, but in India in particular, especially among the left today, there does seem to be a nostalgia for the Nehruvian era, as a contrast to what's happening in the country today. But I do think that somewhere, and maybe there is something, because I see a lot of interest suddenly within the architecture of that era, or within films made in that era. When I think of the nostalgia, and that's why I think it's an important thing for me to, in terms of where is my nostalgia, or where is my nostalgia located, it's not really located in the architecture itself for me. It's in the imagination that there was a future. So it's a nostalgia for that imagination. Right? It did seem to me while we were making the film and while the film emerged that it seemed as if this imagination of a future, okay, as a place, a possible horizon where there was, equality and justice, seemed to be something that people had become cynical about. And people had become, sort of dismissive as something that was romantic and old-fashioned. And because of that, it had enabled many sorts of practices, both within film as well as within architecture, that were not necessarily thinking about the future or thinking about betterness. They were largely thinking in terms of, the pragmatics of the everyday. So when we were really thinking about the idea of the nostalgia, that's what the film is called, Nostalgia for the Future. It's a nostalgia for the possibilities of a horizon where there could be an equality. And I think at some level, the preamble of the Indian Constitution did provide that as a framework. The possibility of liberty, equality, justice, etc., as larger ideas that we could all aspire towards. And I really think that that is really where this particular, the urge to kind of capture that nostalgia of or this imagination of the future emerged from. But I do recognize that there's a very easy danger that it kind of very easily slips into, a kind of a very virulent nationalism as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a quite interesting kind of dynamic, because if we're thinking about nostalgia really as a search for time rather than place,
Yeah.
then the analogy of the cinema as like a time-based medium versus architecture, let's say the built environment, it's a quite interesting kind of metaphor to think about how the two function in tandem, perhaps.
So one of the things I've always thought about in terms of architecture is that too often architectures imagine something that is about the today. When actually, for me, architecture is always about a tomorrow. Because every time you're designing something for whom you want to become. It's a sort of projection of desire that exists in a sort of, tangible form. But it really is, it's like a prosthetic that you wear to transform your body into something that you would like to be.
I think we had some questions at the back. Someone has the microphone already here.
Hi there. Sorry, I think my question is kind of related to his question, and it might just be a question of a further elaboration on a similar point. But for me, India as a nation, especially post-partition, is defined by its sort of innate syncretism, which is being destroyed now in the face of this abject fascism that has infected the Republic. So my question is just that if you were to add or create another chapter to add to the end of your film, I was wondering what you might explore if that chapter were to be kind of a reflection on the kind of rise of this sort of incredibly sort of fascistic and Hindu nationalist rhetoric and agenda that kind of runs through the kind of runs through the kind of like authoritarian figures at the moment. But also and what would that chapter be called? Would it be the distressed body, the broken body? Perhaps you're more optimistic than I am, but I just wanted to ask what you thought.
So the film emerged because of the state of the nation. The nostalgia for the future is emerging from that very idea. A nostalgia for a particular time where India had a certain imagination of who its citizens were supposed to be. And it did seem to us today that imagination had been completely forgotten. We felt it was important for us to recapture that imagination, but also not recapture it without critique. It was also important to acknowledge the fact that that imagination too came with an extremely top-down and sometimes extremely violent mode through which it operated. Whether those were these incredibly large infrastructure projects that displaced millions of people, or the way that languages, for example, sometimes were completely erased, etc. Right? So it was important for us to start thinking about the reclamation of that imagination of that I mentioned earlier, but also do it a little more carefully. So the end sequence of the film, which I couldn't talk about, it's actually a celebration of Dalit women that happens underneath the residue of development, that happens underneath the flower where they are beating drums. Right? And curiously, that claiming of the public sphere by women's bodies happens through the grassroots work that a right-wing organization like the Shiv Sena does in Bombay. Right? So it's a much more complicated picture than we would imagine it to be. A lot of Nehruvian imaginations, for example, continue to be spouted out by our current leaders. So really what they say, what they do, we don't really know where they stand really. So in answer to your question, whether there would be a sequel, well, we are thinking of one right now. We're thinking of one where we are really interested in the way that religion shapes identity. And thinking about that more in terms of what is really happening on the ground rather than this presumption, either from the left or from the right, in the way that it actually exists on the ground. Because I've been to places, I've traveled the country, and went to Braj. I don't know whether you know Braj, but it's the land where Krishna is supposed to have grown up. It's demarcated by a pilgrimage. And each of the sites of the pilgrimage is a sort of innocuous little shrine sometimes, or a little tree. And the kinds of practices that happen there are not necessarily, how should I put it, mainstream Hindutva. They are softer, sometimes more generous to nature and to other cultures and communities. Maybe there is another imagination that we also need to have in terms of how we can approach questions of faith.
May I just add also that while I agree with some of the questions that undergird your question or comments, though I wouldn't use the same terms that you used, Rohan is here today and can have a critical perspective, not only here, but he could do so also if he wanted to in India, which does make it still a place slightly different from others. We had some further questions at the back.
Yeah. Hi. Michelle, I was really interested by how you depicted the boundaries that separated the houses from the outside, and then from the aerial view, this open, very traditional Arabian courtyard, majlis-inspired layout. And I was wondering if in any of the exhibitions that came out, not in an archival sense, but in an immersive sense of experiencing, the separation, but then also the openness. And I also had a question for Alia. You were mentioning how a lot of your work is coming, or a lot of the way you're thinking about urbanism is coming from your standpoint as an artist. But I wanted to ask you about the more anthropological lens that I see in your work and how you gained access to the communities that you've been filming, both as an insider and an outsider.
Go first, Michelle. Okay. I can't see who's asking the question. I'm searching for you. Hi.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I suppose there was a further analogy to the boundaries. It is literally a way for people to approach that space and think about the way in which the past continues to reverberate in the present. But it was also about the process of trying to connect the past and what happens in private spaces and what happened in public spaces. So setting out on this research, the first challenge was literally getting behind those walls. And it became a process of tapping into the many silos that we have existing here and breaking open those so that there could be flows and conversations. So the exhibition was layered once you entered, and those layers were ways of linking between all sorts of places that normally are separated. So I felt that boundary wall was important also as a form of engagement, to bring the viewer inside that arena and then have the viewer proactively opening those drawers, so making a decision after seeing the structure of where do we want to intervene, what do we want to physically learn. And then you'll see, if you were there and opened it, you would see that the labels were not empirical data so much, although they were simple captions, but they were actually bringing the voices of others. For example, if it's an Emirati and non-Emirati, if it's a architect, someone that lived in that building. So it was a constant bringing together, which is what happens inside a majlis, which is what happened inside the courtyard, at least within the family members. So that was what that analogy was about.
And for me, in terms of visiting these places where I film, the way it normally works is I try and go on a scouting trip and spend time there. and locating sites and like identifying people that I can work with. But logistically, yeah, it's always sort of a challenge, you know. In the case of the film that I showed, traveling to Iran was something that, you know, the Sharjah Biennial Foundation was very supportive of the work, said at the end it's at your own risk, you know. And I am fortunate to have friends who are as adventurous and curious in restoring relationships with these places and getting to know the people that were very much once the fabric of the Eastern Arabian Gulf Coast. Regarding the shoot in Iraq, I'm not sure yet how that's going to happen. I'm still figuring out the logistics for that and how I'm going to get there. But that's all scheduled for 2021. So it's like a very slow process in terms of gaining access alone, no? And then another time frame for developing work.
Hi, thank you everybody. My question perhaps is for everybody, is about this idea of the encounter with modernity in the second half of the last century, and which seems to be a common thread from the different perspectives. And rather than thinking of it as the sort of usual idea of modernity as an idea that is imported from the West into this region, I'm interested in whether you had examples or you could expand on how this region became a site of experimentation in architecture or social experimentation. Particularly, I'm looking, for example, I'm researching recently the work of Frei Otto and some of the work that he was doing, a German architect who was working in Saudi Arabia. And I'm sort of interested whether you had some examples or you could expand on this region as a site of experimentation rather than as imported modernity. Thank you.
I'll just step in just a little bit. One of the interesting aspects of the exhibition when we looked at modernity here was to look at the way in which modernism was applied to the extreme heat and the study of vernacular ways of passive cooling and how that was adapted into the architectural skin of many of the skyscrapers. For example, the World Trade Center, the recessed windows and the double layering of the skin. And a lot of the architects working here also had to deal with cultural sensitivities as well in terms of the use of the mashrubiyah and the privacy screening. That is one part of modernity that was expressed here with local interests and local needs that were environmentally focused.
So there's always been this, and it continues to be, an imagination of the modern, or modernism rather, as something that we are responding to that emerges from the West. And there have always been local sorts of urgencies to kind of redefine it, rethink it, recalibrate it. Right, if you see Tagore's experiments with Shantiniketan in India as a new way of imagining an Indian modern, that instead of tracing its journey to the West, traces it to Japan and China and tries to kind of build on those connections to build a modern to the East. Right? But I'm not certain that, so I'm not really certain as to whether the modern, in some sense, that emerged in India had really that much, it wasn't a direct importation that happened from Western Europe actually. It always took some from the United States and Europe. It always had some sort of local kind of transformations that happened, and I think that is fine. I don't really see any reason why one needs to evolve a parallel indigenous modernity as if it can exist without relationships across the globe. It just takes its own sort of flavors when it arrives on the shores of India. Like the palace, right? It had its own sort of way in which it was interpreted.
Do we have more questions?
Good afternoon, or is it still morning? I don't know. My question is to Rohan. And I think I'm going to start with the last comment with regard to modernity and link it to an important aspect in terms of what you speak about in terms of the nostalgia for the future. And I want to move from architecture as a built environment to its social construction, the socio-political architecture or the socio-ethical architecture, and ask you a question. In this nostalgia for the future, and given that the current day where the Hindu nationalism, etc., still preaches this notion that India is the largest democracy in the world, etc., etc. And an Indian intellectual that is complicit in accepting a social architecture that disenfranchises, and in fact, totally accept the rejection of hundreds of millions of Indians through the caste system. How do you conceptualize that? How do you really think that we can talk about a modernity that is not similar to what white South Africans were doing in terms of rejection of the majority of the blacks, okay, through apartheid? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that is one of the primary critiques of the film when it came to the question of the way the modern was imagined to be implemented or realized. Is that although the modern continued to imagine like the possibility of liberty, equality, etc., the mechanisms through which it actually operated emerged from the same ruling classes that had controlled the earlier colonial state. And therefore, in the making of the new cities, like Delhi, it actually perpetuated the same divisions that it had supposedly wanted to critique. That's actually the part of that's the argument of the film. In fact, that's the reason why that entire narrative of people staring at the camera emerges. Because it's really the way the subaltern was imagined by the gaze of the supposed modernizer, as someone who needed to be modernized and needed to be uplifted. It always emerged from a kind of middle-class gaze that said that, okay, now, please modernize because, we have an imagination of the modern for you, and you all need to live up to this, and if you don't, you're underdeveloped, right? And that is really where I feel like the project of modernity, that the Nehruvian project of modernity, largely failed, right? But at the same time, if I look at the story of, I didn't complete the Ambedkar story because the Ambedkar story is a really important story for me in Bombay. Is that, Ambedkar lived in 3 homes when he was in Bombay, 3 houses. He first came in 1904 and lived in a slum, okay? His I think someone in his family got a job with the Bombay Municipal Corporation. And because he got a job in the Bombay Municipal Corporation, they were given housing that was designed by the colonial state, modernist housing, which had toilets. And so they moved into a housing project. A proper kind of housing project. And because he was living in a housing project, he had access to education and he could study at night. Right? It was because of that he was able to access the colleges that he went to and actually was able to go and work with the Maharaja, Sayaji Rao, okay, who then provided him a kind of loan, a scholarship to go to Columbia to study law. So then he he studied law in Columbia. And then he comes back to Bombay and he chooses to build his own house in Hindu colony, okay, with a colonial modern style, actually, with absolutely no Hindu references to speak of. So there is a story here in the way that cities, and that's why I think that cities are a very important kind of instrument of the modern in India because they really provided an opportunity for many to actually find ways outside in unbearable discrimination and poverty within the villages and come into cities and provide. There's an infrastructure that cities provide that was made available first by the colonial government and also by some parts of the new state, whether that's the reservation policies that continue to exist. So it was important for the film and for us also to acknowledge the fact that although the modern state imagines the access to modernity through a particular kind of instrument, there are many other ways in which communities are able to access modernities that may in many ways destabilize these presumptions of the modern Indian states and its institutions. That the last sequence in the film was important to be able to talk about that because it is really a claiming of a modernity by communities of their own accord with absolutely no interference or kind of enablement from the state itself. So it was important for the film to kind of talk about that process. Does that answer your question? Sorry? It is a long dialogue, yeah.
We have time for one more question.
It's over here.
Excuse me? So let's round them up.
Okay, well, mine is very simple, actually. For Rohan, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the gesture of having the film produced by the films division, because you mentioned it last night. I think the word that you used to describe it was appropriate, but it seems that it's a much deeper gesture than just being appropriate. And I wonder if, I mean, how we can look at that. Are you infiltrating the apparatus of propaganda, and if so, how did that work, and what was that like? And yeah, that's pretty much it. And then over to Wood.
Did I answer that, or one more question?
We'll round the questions up.
All right.
Yeah, Alia, I loved your intervention. Because it brought Zar, it brought multi-rhythm in Mumbai. That's all different communities from Africa, etc. And also the fact of the Iranian connections with performance. And in fact, also we have younger artists here showing in andAlserkal that have gone back to Zar and Jinn and things like that. Now, my question to all of you, I guess, would be, is this one, as one wants to break this, the ideology of modernism, the grids, etc., and go to the communities and, that live in these Gulf countries, the multiplicity of them, and then how things are performed in terms of identity, etc. So do you have some, or I guess all of you, ideas about how one could come up with new ways of studying contemporary everyday life that breaks through these sort of grades that have been brought from somewhere else? Yeah.
So Films Division is a very interesting organization. While continues to be the propaganda wing of the government, it also has a history of some extremely interesting and radical filmmaking within the organization itself, especially in the late 60s and early 70s. In fact, there's a filmmaker called Pramod Pati whose work is being shown just next door, right? Because within the organization, there were many people who were, well, in their own kind of way, subverting what the official propaganda message was. For example, there's a filmmaker called S.N.S. Shastri who purportedly made a film on promoting Indian education abroad. But actually, it's a film about young men and women making love, right? So it's a very strange film. Definitely worth watching. It's called This Bit of That India. Right? So what we found, for us it was important to work within Films Division because we felt that as a film that was really talking about imagining who the Indian citizen is or should be or should have been, it was interesting to work with an organization that was instrumental in creating that imagination. When we did make the film, it's not necessarily a propagandist film in the way that it is. So we were a little worried about what the reaction of our producers would be. But we went and we showed it to the producers themselves. And one has to understand that there are just people who are also manning those organizations. Right? So although the people who saw the film did understand that there was an implicit critique of many of the aspects of the state that were embedded within the film, they had absolutely no problem with it. So we found it interesting to think about the institution as not necessarily a large sort of body, but also something that is inhabited by people who are also able to understand the limitations of that very institution itself. So I also felt, this is also something that we feel is that at a time like this that we are currently at in the country, it was important for us to inhabit some of the spaces, however dangerous they might be for us, that the democratic state has provided for documentary film. Because if we just let it go, then it's gone. The opportunity is gone, and in India, there's not that much funding for documentary films anyway. And this is one of the few places that you do get some amount of money to produce a film. So that was actually, I guess, part of the reason. But we decided to use it as an opportunity to play with Films Division's archive itself and make Films Division references within the film and talk about how Films Division itself imaged the citizen.
Yeah, with the work I'm doing, that sort of began with looking at the function of the Kuwait National Museum first in its like modern capacity, but then also looking at the proliferation of museums in the region. I think I became very interested in how it very much tried to kind of contain culture, no? And both modernity and museum cultures as both being this like homogenizing force that kind of makes culture legible, digestible, or also kind of promotes one narrative or very few narratives. And so with my work, I'm interested in kind of complicating the story, no? And like you pointed out, you're familiar with the practice of zar. That's a North African tradition that came to the Gulf, and then it exists also in Iran. And so, kind of blurring all of those boundaries is what I'm interested in doing through my work and research. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think on these words, you wanted to add something?
No, I just wanted to refer one thing regarding a previous question before, and some of these questions is that at a certain point, I think we have been more talking about in the Gulf, and not exactly the case in India, about opportunities that were generated by an idea or an energy of modernization, more than modernity in the sense Rowan was talking about. And I think there is always a misunderstanding between these two elements. On the other hand, I must say that many of the projects, for example, that I showed, they were designed from far. They were not designed where they were conceived. And finally, when they were built, they were the result of a process of negotiation by many people. That finally what was built was in many times far from what was conceived. And on just a last thing is that this idea of import and export of architecture, I think it's a legacy of the first researchers that start developing in the 90s in this region, and that I think it's not relevant anymore. I think the work like Michel had developed and even others already moved ahead of that. The majority of the buildings that we identify with this modern feeling, they were conceived by common people in very, very trivial moments. For example, the Kuwaiti tower that Alia was showing was not conceived by any of the pioneers of modernism, was not conceived by well-known architects, and was the result of a negotiation with the sheikh, like Michel was showing, about I want a decent building that is a water tank, as all the others,
emblematic.
Yeah, but is in front of my house, and I wanted to make it beautiful. And I think this has nothing to do with the discourse of the modern, in a way. And I think that's something I wanted to state.
Thank you, Ricardo. So thank you very much. We have a 1.5 hour lunch break, and we'll meet here again at 2 o'clock. Please join me in thanking our speakers this morning.